In August of 30 BCE, inside a heavily guarded mausoleum in Alexandria, the death of Cleopatra VII brought a definitive end to 3,000 years of dynastic rule along the Nile. With her passing, Octavian annexed Egypt not as a standard Roman province, but as the personal private estate of the Roman emperor, dismantling the sovereign political institutions that had survived since the unification under Narmer, around 3100 BCE. For centuries afterward, popular imagination has chased a romantic mystery. Did a secret, unbroken bloodline of the divine god-kings slip into the shadows of history, waiting to be traced to a single modern heir? The reality of historical power structures is far more complex than a hidden lineage. Ancient Egypt was never a single, uninterrupted biological dynasty. Its crown was repeatedly seized, fractured, and claimed by rival native houses, Libyan chieftains, Nubian monarchs, Persian conquerors, and Macedonian generals. Legitimacy in the Nile Valley was anchored not in pure genetic inheritance, but in a sophisticated ideological apparatus that transformed whoever controlled the agricultural surplus, the temples, and the military into the living incarnation of Horus. To answer where the descendants of the pharaohs are today, we must look beyond royal myths and examine the convergence of population genetics, social history, and statistical mathematics. From the rural agricultural communities that never left the fertile riverbanks to the complex migrations across North Africa and the Mediterranean, the blood of ancient Egypt did not disappear into a vacuum. It dissolved into the broader population, leaving us with a profound conclusion. The true heirs of the pharaohs are not found in isolated aristocracies, but written into the living DNA of millions across the modern world. The modern fascination with a continuous royal bloodline stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of how pharaonic power operated. When modern audiences look at the dynastic lists compiled by the 3rd century BCE priest Manetho, the neat succession of 30 dynasties creates the illusion of an unbroken family tree stretching from the Bronze Age to the Hellenistic era. In practice, however, these dynastic labels were retroactive administrative categories designed to organize regime changes, foreign conquests, and internal collapses, rather than track a single, continuous biological lineage. Royal legitimacy in ancient Egypt was primarily an ideological and religious construct, not a strict biological absolute. The reigning monarch was declared to be the physical embodiment of the god Horus in life and Osiris in death, a theological framework known as theogamy. Through temple rituals and royal propaganda, any ruler capable of consolidating military control and securing the backing of the powerful priesthood could be ritually transformed into a legitimate divine sovereign, retroactively adopting the divine pedigree regardless of their actual genealogical origin. This ideological flexibility was tested repeatedly during the intermediate periods, prolonged eras of central state collapse where the concept of an exclusive royal bloodline completely fractured. During the first intermediate period, circa 2181-2055 BCE, following the decline of the Old Kingdom's centralized bureaucracy, rival nomarchs, provincial governors, in Heracleopolis and Thebes, seized regional power, crowned themselves pharaohs, and fought civil wars for control of the Nile's agricultural surplus, breaking any pretense of dynastic continuity. A similar breakdown occurred during the Second Intermediate Period, circa 1650-1550 BCE, with the arrival of the Hyksos, a Canaanite-descended elite who established the 15th dynasty in the Nile Delta city of Avaris. The Hyksos did not claim native Egyptian royal descent. Instead, they successfully governed Lower Egypt for over a century by adopting Egyptian royal titles, honoring traditional deities like Set, and managing taxation networks. Their presence forced the native 17th dynasty into the role of a regional principality confined to Upper Egypt until the reunification wars waged by Seqenen-Retau and Ahmose-Phir. Even during the heights of native Egyptian military and architectural power in the New Kingdom, biological succession remained inherently fragile. When Amenhotep III died, the radical religious and political reforms introduced by his son, Akhenaten, threw the institutional apparatus into chaos. Following the brief reign of Tutankhamun, whose physical ailments and early death without surviving heirs abruptly extinguished the core 18th dynasty royal house, the crown passed not to a direct blood relative, but to Ai, a high-ranking court official, and subsequently to Horemheb, the supreme military commander of the army. Horemheb had no royal parentage, yet his military pragmatism and institutional restructuring stabilized the Egyptian state after decades of turmoil. To ensure succession, he appointed Parmesu, another seasoned general with no royal pedigree, who ascended the throne as Ramses III, founding the illustrious 19th dynasty. This transition demonstrates that state survival and administrative competence routinely superseded genetic pedigree when the central power of the state was on the line. The third intermediate period, circa 1069-664 BCE, severed central royal succession entirely through a profound decentralization of power. While nominal pharaohs ruled from Tanis in the northern delta, Real political, judicial, and economic authority in Upper Egypt was seized by the high priests of Amun at Thebes. These priests established a hereditary, theocratic dynasty of their own, often marrying into northern royal families, to create a veneer of dynastic harmony, while operating as an autonomous military and financial state within a fractured empire. When examining the long trajectory of ancient Egyptian governance, the concept of a single, continuous royal family tree collapses under historical scrutiny. Dynastic transitions were marked by military coups, regional civil wars, institutional substitutions by the priesthood, and foreign takeovers. The pharaohs were not a single biological family, surviving through 3 millennia. They were a succession of distinct dynasties, warlords, and administrators who maintained the continuity of the state through religious ideology rather than genetic purity. The erosion of native dynastic control reached a decisive turning point during the late New Kingdom, as the Nile Delta experienced substantial demographic shifts from Western tribal migrations. Libyan groups, predominantly the Meshwesh and the Libu, initially entered Egypt as prisoners of war, mercenaries, and settled border populations. Over generations, these Libyan military commanders assimilated into the imperial officer corps, gradually securing control over local garrisons, key trade bottlenecks, and agricultural land in the Delta. By the 10th century BCE, the central state had weakened sufficiently for these military commanders to translate their physical force into political authority. Around 943 BCE, a powerful Meshwesh military chief named Shoshenq I established the 22nd dynasty, marking the formal ascension of Libyan rulers to the pharaonic throne. Shoshenq governed not by eradicating Egyptian traditions, but by mastering them. He adopted classical royal titles, conducted elaborate building campaigns at Karnak, and installed his own sons into the influential office of the high priest of Amun in Thebes to secure religious legitimacy over the south. This integration model transformed the nature of pharaonic governance into a decentralized system of semi-autonomous military fiefdoms. Libyan rulers governed through a network of garrison commanders and family members scattered across delta cities like Bubastis, and Tanis, and Leontopolis. While this structure preserved the ceremonial exterior of the dual crown, the bloodlines of Egypt's rulers became inextricably tied to Western North African lineages, creating a ruling class whose family networks extended far into modern Libyan territories. The fragmentation caused by competing Libyan warlords eventually left Egypt vulnerable from the south. Along the Upper Nile, in modern-day Sudan, the Kingdom of Kush had developed into a formidable military and religious power, deeply devoted to the worship of Amun at the holy mountain of Gebel Barkal. Seeing the moral and political breakdown of Egypt's northern cities, Kushite King Paye launched an expedition northward around 728 BCE, framing his military campaign not as a foreign conquest, but as a holy crusade to restore proper religious order to the Nile Valley. Paye's successful subjugation of Egypt founded the 25th dynasty, commonly known as the Nubian or Kushite dynasty. Kings such as Shabaka and Taharqa ruled an empire stretching from modern Khartoum to the Mediterranean coast, presenting themselves as the ultimate defenders of classical Egyptian culture, art, and architecture. Taharqa initiated massive construction projects at Karnak and Memphis, reviving the Old Kingdom architectural style and asserting Egyptian sovereignty against the rising threat of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Kushite royal line, however, faced insurmountable pressure from Assyrian military superiority. Following successive invasions by Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, the Nubian kings were pushed south beyond the First Cataract. Yet, their claim to the pharaonic title did not vanish. The Kushite royal family continued to rule from Napata and later Meroe for nearly 1,000 years, constructing royal pyramid fields, venerating Egyptian deities, and developing the Meroitic script, preserving a distinct branch of pharaonic lineage on Sudanese soil long after Egypt itself fell to foreign conquerors. In Egypt, a brief native renaissance under the 26th Sate dynasty was abruptly ended in 505 BCE by the imperial expansion of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Led by Cambyses II, Persian forces defeated Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium, reducing Egypt from an autonomous kingdom to the 6th satrapy of the Persian Empire. Unlike previous rulers who governed directly from the Nile Valley, Persian emperors like Darius I and Xerxes ruled from Susa and Persepolis, visiting Egypt primarily to inspect royal infrastructure, oversee tax collection, and ensure geopolitical control over Mediterranean maritime trade. Darius I demonstrated a pragmatic approach to governance, commissioning legal codifications, funding the construction of temples in the Karga Oasis, and completing an early canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea. Despite adopting the royal titularies of Upper and Lower Egypt, the Persian monarchs governed through appointed imperial satraps and extracted substantial agricultural wealth to fund campaigns across the Mediterranean and Asia. With the crown subordinated to an empire centered thousands of kilometers away, the concept of a sovereign, local Egyptian royal lineage had been permanently dismantled. Following the fall of Alexandria and the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE, Octavian instituted an administrative revolution designed to neutralize Egypt's native nobility and permanently dismantle any claim to the pharaonic crown. Recognizing the territory's immense wealth and strategic importance as the primary grain supplier to Rome, Octavian did not establish Egypt as a standard senatorial province. Instead, it was designated as an imperium proconsulare maius, a private administrative domain directly accountable to the Roman emperor, managed not by patrician senators, who were strictly barred from entering Egypt without explicit imperial permission, but by a hand-picked prefect from the equestrian class. This structural overhaul dismantled the traditional role of native Egyptian elites in central statecraft. Under the newly enforced legal hierarchy, the population was strictly divided into distinct civic classes. Roman citizens held supreme legal and fiscal privilege. Citizens of self-governing Greek polis like Alexandria, Ptolemais, and Naucratis enjoyed elevated status and tax exemptions, while the vast indigenous Egyptian population, categorized collectively as Aegyptioi, was reduced to the status of provincial taxpayers subjected to a punitive poll tax, the Laiographia. Native Egyptians were systematically excluded from high military commands, fiscal governance, and judicial administration, effectively stripping the old landed families and temple administrators of their political leverage. The economic core of this Roman restructuring was focused on the extraction of agrarian surplus through a centralized bureaucratic apparatus. Native farmers were tied to their plots through strict municipal registries, census tracking, enforced agrarian labor, liturgies, to maintain the complex network of irrigation canals and dikes along the Nile. The immense grain harvest was collected, measured, and funneled through Alexandria to supply the Annona, the subsidized grain dole that sustained the urban masses of Rome. Rather than reinforcing the legitimacy of native dynastic houses, the Roman fiscal engine reduced the ancient land of the god-kings to an extractive agricultural enterprise. By barring native Egyptians from the highest ranks of Roman citizenship and political decision-making, the imperial administration ensured that no local aristocrat could gather the resources or ideological legitimacy to contest Roman dominion. The temples, once autonomous economic powerhouses possessing vast estates and private armies of scribes, were placed under the strict supervision of the Roman Idios Logos, the Department of Special Revenues, which audited temple treasuries, regulated priestly appointments, and curtailed hereditary privileges. Stripped of political agency and economic autonomy, the descendants of Egypt's ruling classes were absorbed entirely into the wider fabric of provincial society, leaving the sovereign legacy of the pharaohs permanently extinguished under Roman rule. In 2017, a landmark archaeogenetic study led by the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History and the University of Tübingen published the first reliable high-throughput genome sequencing of ancient mummified remains. Analyzing 151 mummies from the archaeological site of Abusir el-Melek in Middle Egypt, spanning over 1,300 years from the late New Kingdom through the Roman period, the researchers extracted genuine ancient DNA from teeth and bone structures that had resisted environmental degradation. The resulting data provided the first direct empirical window into the genetic profile of the Nile Valley's ancient inhabitants. The genomic analysis yielded striking results regarding the ancestral affinities of ancient Egyptians. The data demonstrated that the ancient population of Abusir el-Melek was genetically closest to ancient and modern Near Eastern and Levantine populations, as well as ancient Anatolian and European groups, rather than sub-Saharan Africans. For more than a millennium, across transitions between native dynasties, Persian rule, and Ptolemaic Greek administration, this genetic profile remained remarkably stable, indicating that major political and imperial conquests caused relatively little disruption to the local agrarian population base. When researchers compared this ancient dataset to modern Egyptian populations, they uncovered a significant genetic shift that occurred after the Roman era. Modern Egyptians share the same core ancestral components as their ancient predecessors, but they possess an additional 8% to 15% sub-Saharan African genetic admixture that was largely absent in the ancient mummies of Abusir el-Melek. Geneticists attribute this shift to increased trans-Saharan mobility, maritime Red Sea trade networks, and the dynamics of the Arab and trans-Saharan slave trade over the last 1,500 years. These findings fundamentally reshape how historians interpret the legacy of ancient Egyptian lineages. The genetic evidence dispels romantic notions of a vanishing, isolated race, demonstrating instead a deep ancestral continuity in the Nile Valley that gradually assimilated regional migrations over millennia. While modern populations carry distinct subsequent admixtures, the fundamental genetic foundation of ancient Egypt remains woven into the broader demographic fabric of the contemporary Middle East and North Africa. While empires rose and fell in monumental stone capitals, the day-to-day survival of the Egyptian population remained anchored to the rhythmic ecology of the Nile River. In the rural villages of Upper Egypt, Al Said, The fellahin, the indigenous agricultural laborers, maintained farming practices, irrigation techniques, and social customs that survived the collapse of every dynasty. Long after the construction of the high dam at Aswan altered the Nile's natural hydrological cycle, traditional farmers continued organizing their agricultural calendars around the ancient tripartite division of the year: Akhet, inundation; Peret, growing; and Shamu, harvest, demonstrating that the behavioral pulse of pharaonic life was carried by the working population rather than the court elites. This deep agrarian continuity is reflected in the physical tools and canal engineering systems preserved across southern Egypt. Up until the mid-20th century, rural farmers relied on the shaduf, a counterweighted lever system documented on tomb frescoes from the New Kingdom, to lift water from the river channels into tiered irrigation basins. Similarly, the communal management of seasonal floodwaters, basin irrigation networks, and local land division adhered to legal and customary frameworks that evolved from the administrative records of the Middle and New Kingdoms, where local village councils managed agrarian disputes independently of centralized bureaucratic changes. Beyond agriculture, indigenous customary law in Upper Egypt preserved social codes and dispute resolution mechanisms that predate Islamic and Roman legal systems. Traditional village councils, known as Majlis al-Orf, customary reconciliation courts, resolve land boundary disputes, family feuds, and water rights through collective arbitration overseen by village elders. The emphasis on restorative justice, balance, and communal harmony within these rural assemblies directly mirrors the ancient principle of Ma'at, the ideological cornerstone of cosmic and societal order in pharaonic Egypt. Cultural rituals surrounding life, death, and seasonal transitions similarly retained Bronze Age roots beneath the veneer of subsequent religious shifts. Across rural communities, the annual celebration of Sham and Nassim, marking the beginning of spring, continues traditions of eating salted fish, fasik, onions, and lettuce, direct descendants of offerings made during the ancient festival of Shemu. In mortuary customs, women in isolated villages along the Nile Valley preserved traditional lamentation cycles, public mourning chants, and funerary processions that bear unmistakable structural parallels to the mourning rituals depicted in the tomb chapels of Luxor and Saqqara. These enduring cultural practices illustrate that the true legacy of ancient Egypt did not depend on the preservation of a royal bloodline. While foreign invaders seized royal titles and collected agrarian taxes, the foundational population of the Nile Valley continued tilling the same soil, utilizing the same hydraulic knowledge, and observing the same seasonal rhythms for millennia. The living continuity of ancient Egypt was sustained not through the political decrees of dynastic rulers, but through the unbroken labor and cultural resilience of its rural people. The rise of the Muhammad Ali dynasty in the early 19th century created a profound ideological paradox at the heart of modern Egyptian governance. Muhammad Ali Pasha, an Ottoman Albanian military commander who seized control of Egypt following the French withdrawal in 1801, established an autonomous hereditary dynasty with zero biological connection to the ancient land he ruled. The ruling elite spoke Ottoman Turkish, organized the military along French lines, and operated within an imperial Islamic framework. Yet they presided over an indigenous Arabophone population possessing thousands of years of continuous Nile Valley settlement. To legitimize his state-building project and assert independence from the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, Muhammad Ali strategically utilized Egypt's antiquities as diplomatic currency while modernizing the state's agricultural infrastructure. His administration systematically cleared ancient irrigation canals, introduced long staple cotton for European markets, and granted Western consuls and treasure hunters unprecedented access to ancient monuments in exchange for modern industrial machinery, armaments, and geopolitical support. In doing so, the dynasty treated ancient Egypt not as an ancestral inheritance, but as a sovereign resource to finance the creation of a modern regional empire. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this dynamic shifted dramatically under his successors, Khedive Ismail and King Fuad I. Confronted by British imperial occupation in 1882 and the rapid growth of native Egyptian nationalism, the monarchy began actively co-opting pharaonic imagery into the visual language of the state. Monumental civic architecture in Cairo, official state currency, royal postage stamps, and public ceremonies began featuring lotus motifs, winged sun discs, and pharaonic iconography, deliberately bridging the Ottoman-descended royal house with the grand heritage of the Nile's ancient rulers. This state-sponsored visual synthesis reached its peak during the 1920s, following the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 and Egypt's nominal independence from Britain. Intellectuals, artists, and royalist politicians coalesced around the concept of Pharaonism, al-Fir'auniyya, an ideology that framed Egyptian national identity not primarily through Ottoman, Pan-Arab, or religious lenses, but through a distinct, non-sectarian historical lineage dating back to the god kings. While King Farouk and his predecessors could not claim the literal blood of Ramses II, they successfully engineered a national consciousness where the modern state claimed the exclusive legal and cultural custody of the pharaonic legacy. When investigating whether modern people descend from ancient Egyptian royalty, the answer is governed by mathematical certainty rather than genealogical records. In 1999, Yale statistician Joseph Chang published a landmark mathematical model demonstrating the phenomenon of pedigree collapse. Because every individual has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and 8 great-grandparents, the number of direct ancestors doubles with every generation into the past, projected back 3 millennia to the New Kingdom. A purely theoretical family tree would require trillions of ancestors, vastly exceeding the total number of humans who have ever lived. This geometric expansion means that human family trees do not expand infinitely outwards like branches. Instead, they constantly loop back and intertwine through pedigree collapse. Chang's model identified a mathematical threshold known as the identical ancestors point, IAP. Beyond this historical horizon, the family tree of an entire interconnected population coalesces. Every single person alive at that time who left surviving descendants is an ancestor to everyone in the contemporary population, while those who did not leave surviving lineages died out entirely. When applied to the ancient Mediterranean and the Near East, statistical modeling places the regional identical ancestors point comfortably within the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. Because the Nile Valley was never a closed biological island, participating continuously in regional trade, military campaigns, imperial enslavement, and maritime commerce across the Mediterranean and Red Seas, pharaonic royal bloodlines did not remain confined to an elite royal vacuum. Through younger royal children, aristocratic concubinage, political marriages, and intermarriage with broader provincial classes across dozens of generations, royal genetic markers diffused outward into the wider regional gene pool. The mathematical reality leads to a conclusion that overturns centuries of royalist mysticism. If an ancient Egyptian monarch, such as Ramses II or Thutmose III, left a biological line that survived the collapse of antiquity, then virtually every modern person with ancestral ties to North Africa, the Middle East, and the broader Mediterranean basin is a direct descendant of that monarch. The search for a solitary, exclusive heir to the pharaonic crown is a biological impossibility. The genetic legacy of Egypt's ancient rulers was democratized by the relentless arithmetic of human ancestry.